Okay, thanks for having me here. This is joint work with Benjamin Born now at the University of Mannheim. I must say it's now really hard to follow up after Jesus' presentation because the papers are very similar. They were written in parallel without knowing of each other, and a lot of the stuff he already presented you're going to see here again. I'm trying to repeat not too much, so probably it will be a bit shorter. So apparently uncertainty is currently a big topic, and somehow it seems to be the only certainty in life. But for particular for the Republican Party and the Wall Street Journal, political uncertainty has been a big topic. And the general talking point here seems to be that, for example, businesses are hoarding cash due to the uncertainty created in Washington. And the idea is that there is kind of a wait-and-see approach induced by this uncertainty, and that's holding back the recovery. And last year, political uncertainty has become really policy relevant because the Federal Open Market Committee member Fisher from the Dallas Fed actually cited political uncertainty as the reason why he was dissenting from the Fed's decision or the promise or commitment to keep interest rates low for a prolonged period of time. Then, of course, a lot of economists, like even our Nobel Prize winner Thomas Sargent, said something. But if you consider our profession as a whole, people are not that certain. So this is from The Economist, and they did a survey with about 600 economists asking them, why has the recovery been so slow? And one of the options was uncertainty about future policy. And we see that about 20% said it's not important at all. And then about the same amount of economists said, well, it's very, very important. So probably the people in this room, I don't need to persuade that it might be rather very important, but I'm trying to.
It has the highest share of very important. Although I think much like Luke's comment yesterday, if you removed all of us that responded, I certainly responded to this, no matter what.
But we've got paid people.
That's what the some RIOs are doing.
Yeah.
Was the sample academic or?
It was academic, so they sent, I think, emails out to all the NBR members.
Yeah, and then a bunch of.
And then.
It was the Greg from The Economist.
Anyone
that's in the NBR?
Yeah, I got that. I feel it. Okay, so of course I say it was very important.
And then in Europe, they sent it out to the CPR.
Sorry, I just grabbed it.
Yeah, nice things.
It was the NBR Wall Street Economist. About it, apparently. Interestingly, there was an article in the response is about equal, but you can imagine a political outcome. It asked who would be the best president. The two different groups have 25-75 on Obama and Romney, but you can imagine the NBR was all Obama and Wall Street was all Romney.
And you also had one economist saying that he's for his cousin, so you know it's Miles Kimball answering. So you could directly identify him with his comments. Okay. Now in this paper we asked the question, are those policy risk shocks quantitatively important for explaining business cycles? And the focus here is on what we term policy risk. You could also call it fiscal uncertainty. And here it's uncertainty about future tax liabilities, government spending, and monetary policy. And as we saw in Jesus' paper, we directly measure aggregate uncertainty from a respective time series without the need to resort to other proxies. And then in the second step, we integrate those estimates into a new Keynesian DSGE model, typically used for policy analysis. And as we also already saw in his paper, the reason why you need some type of price stickiness in those models, because otherwise uncertainty would definitely be expansionary. Probably I don't have to say much about what we mean.
Sorry, just to check, but the reason, coming back to the discussion now, the reason uncertainty would definitely be expansion without price stickiness is this.
If you don't have non-convexities.
The fact that you expand on good shocks, contract on bad shocks, that would be like.
Yeah, essentially it's the Baso-Bandig argument, that if you have precautionary motives of households, they want to consume less, but they want to work more. And you have the production function where technology doesn't change. Capital is usually predetermined, but labor went up, so that means output has to go up. And that implies that investment actually goes up.
Okay, So that's a different mechanism. Fine. Okay, so that's it. I thought that mechanism requires, Jesus knows it's better than me, but I thought that mechanism requires some assumption into temporal elasticity of substitution. In these models, in these G models, uncertainty goes up, you want to save more. So the thing you want to save in capitals become more uncertain. And is it the IES is greater than 1?
Yeah. So the in
I
general,
think the key point is that capital is predetermined, right, and the impact. So there's not much you can have an impact on having a stock. So all the action goes to labor. And through this precautionary saving mechanism, it's going to work more. So at the impact, hours go up and after goes up. Then later you can have all these effects.
yeah, but without any type of rigidity in some part of this process, that type of adjustment is very, very fast. Okay, very, very fast. So that's why you need something, like a fixed something in some place.
Yeah. I think it depends on the third derivative.
Yeah, no, I know.
Trade-off between these two things you said, I think the third derivative governs it.
Yes, but this is the problem of this is in G, in general equilibrium. So, and Nick was absolutely right. You want to save more, but the only thing in which you want to save more is capital. It's capital because it's the only net asset in the economy. But now capital is more risky because you have more volatility. So you have like things on both directions, and they nearly cancel each other. So yes,
what governs that trade-off?
Yeah, I know, but for any reasonable utility functions, without any type of rigidity, you are going to get very, very good. That's my honesty.
And that's why you kind of need those endogenous markup changes that act like a tax on your income, and then in the next step lead to, on impact, a decrease. Okay. So as standard in literature, we define uncertainty as the dispersion of the shock distribution, and that here means that rational agents react to the fact that future shocks are drawn from a wider distribution. So that's a standard mean preserving spread. The example you might want to think about is, for example, the discussions about the fiscal stimulus in the United States after the financial crisis, where the discussion was, on the one side, we need to stimulate the economy by lowering tax rates. On the other hand, people at the same time were claiming we need to balance the federal budget potentially by raising tax rates. So that's without a clear direction, you expect the mean to stay constant, and that's the thing we're thinking about. For the current situation, you might rather want to think about it as kind of a news shock, because regardless of how this political thing plays out, you expect fiscal policy to become more contractionary, either by increasing taxes or decreased government spending. And in Europe, if you do this presentation, you always have to tell them that uncertainty is not a synonym here for bad expectations, because usually you have people saying, well, I feel uncertain about the situation in Greece, which is usually code for Greece is going down the drain. That's exactly not what you're talking about. So risk here is two-sided, not one-sided. Short overview of the related literature you're most probably aware of. So in the macroeconomic literature, the scientific evidence is I would still claim, mostly inconclusive. There are studies that say that uncertainty matters, most importantly the studies by Nick. But on the other hand, you have other studies saying the effects are rather small. You have the same if you look at VAR studies. So for example, Alexopoulos-Cohen is a VAR study. They find that uncertainty leads to a decrease in output of 1 to 2%. And the Popescu-Smits paper is also a VAR study, and they find that it's negligible. So here I would say it's pretty inconclusive. The policy uncertainty itself is a relatively unexplored field from a macroeconomic perspective. When we started that project, you had essentially one paper, which was the one by Jesus, and later on there was the Becker Friedman Davis paper. And in that paper, as we saw, the effects are a bit larger. For Jesus' paper, they say that it has policy uncertainty has an effect as a 30 basis point rise in the federal funds rate. And if you look at the macroeconomic literature, people would usually argue that monetary policy has not that large effects, which in turn means that I would say this paper kind of rather falls into the camp that says it has rather small effects or potentially small effects. So our paper can be seen as a theoretical thought experiment. And the idea here is that, at least in general equilibrium models, you have a variety of potentially countervailing effects. And that means you can have, at least in theory, ambiguous effects of uncertainty on economic activity. So for example, usually people, or at least economists, argue that uncertainty is depressing for economic output, and that usually is based on the real options notion that you have in partial equilibrium theory, where if your investment project becomes more uncertain, that means that you want to delay your investment project and investment goes down. But then in general equilibrium, you might have the effect that people want to self-insure against this higher uncertainty, want to save more, which then usually would drive the interest rate down, and then in turn would be kind of counteracting for the real options effect. And you have similar other effects at work, for example, Hartmann-Abel effects, and in the end I would claim it's a quantitative matter in which direction the effect plays out. Now this study can be seen as a quantitative thought experiment with certain assumptions. I want to make them very clear in the beginning. So the first thing is we assume that all uncertainty is exogenous. So in the sense that uncertainty might be endogenous, that is a response to, for example, level shocks going on somewhere. Then we might overstate the effects. And we consider only aggregate uncertainty, as also in Jesus' paper. And also our relevant uncertainty measure is what we term objective uncertainty. So in the end, we are going to do a rational expectations model, which means that the uncertainty measure to which our agents react has to be actually consistent with the amount of uncertainty we find in the data. So that's exactly the same assumption as we saw in the previous paper, but that also means that we are potentially losing out on all the effects that Becker et al. In their paper are looking at, because there, if you look at newspapers, it might be that people actually act out of a feeling that things are actually more uncertain than the data realization, so the realized volatility might show. And then thirdly, we consider the transmission mechanisms mostly as embedded in the standard New Keynesian DSGE models. That is, we do not tailor our model explicitly to generate as large uncertainty effects as possible, but rather we take an off-the-shelf model that's typically used in central banks for analyzing business cycles, and then see what this model is going to tell us. First step is empirical evidence. Now those are the series we are going to consider. You have on the one hand capital taxes, labor taxes, then you have TFP, investment-specific technology, monetary policy shocks, and government spending. And you see that at least in some series, the stochastic volatility is pretty evident. Most importantly for monetary policy, you directly see this huge volatility spike in the Volcker-Burns period, which declines subsequently. But you also see that those series have quite some persistence. The way we estimate them is also by specifying, in that case, an exogenous process for the policies. We use AR2 processes because the data show that the first two autocorrelation coefficients are significant. After that, they're essentially zero. That's the reason why we use an AR2 process. And for technology, we do the same. So we have capital taxes, labor taxes, government spending, and monetary policy as our policy instruments where we have uncertainty about. And then we also consider technology uncertainty, so TFP and investment-specific technology. And the different thing compared to usual AR1 or AR processes for its policy is, as we saw before, that our standard deviations follow an AR1 stochastic volatility process. And so the different thing is that you have a separate shock epsilon t here that's driving the volatility, and that has some advantages compared to the usual gauge model. So one of them is that it usually fits the data better with a similar number of parameters. But more important for us, it allows for contemporaneous effects of volatility shocks. So if you consider a gauge model, what you usually have is that volatility only reacts with a one-period lag to the realization of the level shocks in the previous period. So you don't have contemporaneous effects. And most importantly, it allows to separate volatility from level shocks. So as we already heard, if you have a gauge model, the only way volatility can increase is if you have a large level shock, nu t, in the period before, and that in the next step endogenously drives up the volatility. And in that sense, it wouldn't, in terms of a structural model, not make much sense to talk about uncertainty shocks, because then uncertainty would rather be kind of a transmission mechanism. You have some level shock that hits, and then the uncertainty rises only because of that level shock, and is thereby endogenous and only an amplification mechanism.
So you can have volatility, again, just to be so you can have volatility going up in advance of the actual shock.
In principle, yes. So in terms of estimation, it's a bit tricky, I would say, because in theory, this epsilon and the nu are completely uncorrelated, but in the way you estimate it with a likelihood function, it's kind of a trade-off between, if you observe a huge shock, you're weighing off the likelihood between having...
If you're smoothing sigma and you see a big jump in the realization, sigma will be presumably symmetrically smoothed up, rising around it.
So an alternative to stochastic volatility models is Markov reduced switching models. And one of the reasons why Egdol and all these guys like it is because they complain. Imagine that you have a shock, like a change in the level. And what the likelihood doesn't want to do like in just one period. So what the likelihood is we like to do is start accumulating an increase in volatility without any actual realization of the shock to the innovation.
Right.
And you are going to bias the thing. And that's why in financial econometrics, they like to estimate processes that have both Poisson jumps and stochastic volatility. It's just that in macro, we just don't have.
Well, I was thinking with policy, interestingly, you want the vol rising in my sense is once the tax changes happen, the uncertainty is the reverse of what I don't know, somehow for stocks, when the stocks start bouncing up and down, volatility runs forwards, but with policy you kind of think of, because it's so well signposted that once the tax changes happen, that's when the volatility is over.
The problem that you may have is that if something really, really unexpected happens, so let's imagine September 11. And September 11, the next morning Bush comes and announces that from now on we need to walk with a hat, and that changes our incentives. The likelihood function in that type of thing will start accumulating changes in 2000.
So as long as it's standard, like what we're going, if it's fiscal cliff type things.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. If it's September 11, it may not make sense.
So I guess to have the effects that Nick is thinking about, we will need to estimate the entire model. So we need to estimate the model and the process jointly. Then maybe you would observe this big drop in real activity, and ex post, in fact, we observe in average some changes in taxation or in transfers, and sometimes say, oh, going back, doing the smoothing, that initial drop in real activity we saw was a result of uncertainty.
But if you could do that estimating a process of stochastic volatility with Poisson jumps and with controls for other observables.
Right, I agree, but
it would be very. You really will need a lot of data.
Yeah.
So the problem I kind of see is that those big jumps, for example, in a capital tax rate, immediately show up also in your paper as jumps in volatility. So there is some relation, although you assume those shocks are independent, there is some relation between the level and the volatility. Okay, and for the estimation procedure, we use a particle filter and a tailored randomized block Metropolis-Hastings algorithm to evaluate and maximize the posterior likelihood by Bayesian methods. And then in the next step, given that we have found the parameters at the posterior mode, we can then use a backward smoothing routine to get the historical distribution of the volatilities.
What's the backward smoothing part? I think I don't really understand why.
So if you're filtering, it's kind of only backward looking. So for constructing the volatility at the current point in time, you only look at the data you had in the past. While for smoothing, you consider your best state estimate given your whole set of data. And that in that type of model means you essentially have to filter it 1 times backwards in the procedure, so to get an best estimate of the state given all your data set. So it's kind of something like the Kalman filter as opposed to the Kalman smoother. If you do that, you get those processes here, and as you could also already have expected, most of those processes are really persistent. It's something like if taxes go up, they don't really tend to go down again, something like that. But what is important for us, we find considerable evidence for stochastic volatility. So one standard deviation increase or one standard deviation shock to the volatility equation means that capital taxes go up by 46%. It's 92% for labor taxes. But we also have it for the other processes. So there's evidence for stochastic volatility in all those macro series. Now this is a similar picture to what Jesus showed us. It shows the estimated volatilities, so our unobserved state, over our sample, which starts in the 60s and goes to 2011. What you see here is that particularly the 1960s and the 1970s were plagued by high shock volatilities. You have that for, as you see here, for both the technology variables, which show quite a high volatility at that time, but you also have it for government spending, for example, that they are well above their unconditional mean. I'm not sure that you can really see the red dotted line here, which shows the unconditional mean. So at the beginning of the 60s and beginning of the 70s, we're actually above those. So you see also here. But then starting in about the 80s, that picture changes. So we see that TFP uncertainty, for example, tends to be below its unconditional mean. So this is what usually people ascribe to as the good luck hypothesis, if you want to explain the credit moderation, because we see that the shock volatilities of the technology processes went down. But at the same time, we also see evidence of good policy. So for example, for monetary policy, we clearly have a huge increase in the volatility of the monetary policy shock, which is driven by the Burns and Volcker disinflation. But afterwards, it's considerably lower. So that's one point of evidence for good policy. But we have something similar for the tax rates, at least most of the time. So that's also evidence of good policy. But then with the recession after 9/11 and the Bush tax cuts, we again see an increase in uncertainty about labor taxes. We have something similar for the capital taxes. And for TFP, with the new economy bubble, you also see a small increase.
Can I ask?
Yes?
So here it's a bit hard to infer from this graph now. So because you estimate the modeling log, these are the sigma. Well, let me ask the question. So do you find any evidence that there is some kind of asymmetry in this perturbation? So what I mean with this is that most of the time you are below average in terms of volatility, and once in a while you have very large spikes up. So again, here we can't just look at this graph because these are transformations of what you actually estimate. But have you tried to plot this directly the logs and see what happens if there is some kind of asymmetry? Is there an asymmetry in the kind of innovations we observe to volatility? In the sense, the assumption here is everything is symmetric. You have periods of, let's say, 50% of periods of low volatility and 50% periods of high volatility with a particular mean. So simplifying things, no? Looking at this graph, it seems more like most of the time maybe there's some kind of low volatility, and once in a while there are very big spikes in volatility. Then I said, we can't just make this conclusion based on this graph because we estimate a model in logs, and I think these are the actual standard deviations. So I was asking, if we plot the same things in logs.
It's in the paper, and then it kind of looks IID as you would expect from the underlying assumption that you have with the particle filter, that the shock is drawn from a normal distribution.
So if we plot the logs of these standard deviations, they look symmetric around the mean? Okay, that's interesting.
You're saying this is a scaling issue.
Yeah.
That's the e to the power of.
Yeah, but that's what the likelihood wants to do. So it's not surprising. I mean, it may be a misspecified thing, but it's not surprising.
No. Exactly. That's what I was after, actually. Yeah. But I got cut down immediately.
But what you also see here, and that's, I would say, a bit of a problem, that if you look at the current situation, you don't see that the shock volatilities are considerably larger than what we have seen at comparable recessions like after 9/11. So in that sense, at least from the realized volatilities, it currently doesn't look like this time is different. So and that might be the difference between looking at objective uncertainty versus subjective uncertainty. So in the news measure index, you see a huge spike, but in data, that's not really that present.
These are all the agents' views of volatility here as well. They're both estimated and what the agents have been. So, linked to what Anna was talking about yesterday.
So if we assume that our agents actually, so later if you plug those things in a model, you kind of assume they know, they can actually observe it. But if you assume that they do it based on this inference problem, that would be what we endow our agents with as information.
These are smoothed.
Yes. So they
It's what
actually
you
they have
see
a
at
bit
the end of
less.
the period. That's
Yes.
what I thought it was.
It's done, yeah. This is, in a sense, it's full information of the
Yes.
state of the world.
Now we'll briefly go over the model. The idea here is to incorporate into the model several channels identified in the theoretical literature through which accurate uncertainty may impact on economic activity. So the channels are kind of as they are standard in those models, but it's nevertheless worth pointing them out. We have on the one hand precautionary savings. or in general precautionary motive of our households. Then there are some real options effects involved with, for example, time to build in capital, which is here 1 period. You also have capital adjustment costs, which gives you some options effects. You have those Hartmann-Abel effects, where the marginal revenue product of your firm is convex. And we then employ a Smets-Wouters type New Keynesian DSGE model with variable capital utilization, capital adjustment costs, and depreciation allowances. So on the household side, we have a large representative family with a continuum of identical members. Labor here is supplied uniformly to a continuum of monopolistically competitive unions. And in terms of preferences, we use the Jaimovich-Rebello preferences with habits and consumption. And the different thing compared to the standard King-Plosser-Rebello type of preferences is that you have this S here, which is defined like this, and this sigma G here essentially allows scaling the wealth effect on the labor supply. So this nests both the standard King-Plosser-Rebello preferences and the Greenwald-Hershowitz-Huffman type of preference where you shut off the wealth effect on the labor supply. And we're later going to estimate the model, and there we find that there is pretty strong evidence from data that we actually have a very, very low wealth effect on the labor supply. But that also means that in contrast to Jesus' model, that our model will attribute much more importance to the labor tax shocks compared to the capital tax shocks. And we also did our model with King-Plosser-Rebello preferences, and then the results turn around that you get actually again that capital tax shocks are more important. But in our case, the data tells us we have a low wealth effect on the labor supply, which also is consistent with studies from news shocks, for example, which find that this is something we need to fit the data better. And you have the same if you consider the effects of government spending shocks. There's also an argument that this is the type of preferences you might want to use.
Do you do this to basically estimate how much your GHH versus KPR is?
You have a flexible parameter here that you can estimate. We do a simulated method of moments approach, and then this parameter tends to run to 0. But we don't want to have GHH itself, because then you don't have balanced growth path anymore. We actually bound it at 0.001, which essentially for all practical purposes is equivalent to saying you have GHH.
Do is take GHH, but the gamma, the parameter in front of labor supply, you can deflate it, or you can scale it by the growth rate of the economy. And the argument is, that you also enjoy leisure more because you have a better TV.
Yes, you can do it, but for practical purposes, I think it's the same. So if you look at...
That's what Jeremy always does.
For households, we have standard budget constraints, so a household can invest in consumption and investment goods and into bonds. Now, the different thing from the basic types of models is that you have a set ZTI here, which is the relative price of investment, which is stochastic, which in that case means that we also introduce a stochastic resale price of investment. And that in some sense we get at least a bit of costly reversibility and expandability here. Because if you buy capital today at, let's say, a price of 1, this price might go up in the next period, and if you want to de-invest, it means that your price has changed. So that gives you some options channel in there. In terms of income, our household receives after-tax income from working, but also from holding capital, and then the capital gains are taxed here. And this fee here is depreciation allowances, which are an important feature of the actual tax code, where investment provides a tax shield at current cost for new investment. So if you ZT times IT, which is the price at which you bought your investment goods, delta 1 minus delta to the power of S minus 1 is the non-depreciated part. And this non-depreciated part in current period is depreciated with delta. And this part here, so your depreciation, is subtracted from your actual tax bill at the rate tau k. Now the law of motion for capital is this here. On the one hand, we have capital, utilization costs for capital. So our household, despite of having 1 period time to build, can adjust the utilization of capital in a current period. And we have Hayashi capital adjustment costs, quadratic ones, which also give you some option-like features. So in that sense, variable capital utilization here means that using your capital with an intensity higher than normal incurs your costs in the form of a higher depreciation rate. And that's one important mechanism here, because although our firms, or if you're uncertain about the future, you can always use capital utilization to adjust your current use of capital. And depending on the strength of those effects, so the relative size of the capital adjustment costs versus the costs of capital utilization, you might get different effects in terms of overall effects, so which dominates. Because if it's very costly to shortly adjust capital, but you still have the opportunity to vary the utilization of your capital, you might just want, in face of higher uncertainty, to invest quite a lot and then if a lower realization of the shocks hits, you might want to scale down by your utilization and save this capital over time until the uncertainty has subsided. So our firms are a continuum of monopolistically competitive intermediate goods firms. So standard Cobb-Douglas production function with AR2 process for total factor productivity, and those intermediate firms are bundled, or the goods are bundled into a final good. Government spending is an AR2 process with stochastic volatility. We have the same as I showed before with capital and labor tax rates. And then we have a Taylor rule with an interest rate smoothing part. Our central bank reacts to inflation and to output growth, which is one way of avoiding the problem that usually central banks cannot observe natural output. So the central bank reacts to something that's actually observed, and that's usually something that also fits data quite well. And then the Taylor rule is subject to monetary policy shock, where you have uncertainty about. Regarding the model solution estimation, we have the same problem as Jesus, because due to the inherent nonlinearities in the model, we have to solve the model by a third-order perturbation, because this only allows us to control for level shocks when determining the importance of policy risk. And we then go on to estimate the parameters of the model by a simulated method of moments approach. And the series we use for that are output, consumption, investment, inflation, the real wage, and the nominal interest rate. And the moments we match are the standard deviations, the first and second order autocovariances, and the covariance with output.
Does it matter that much which moments you use?
We haven't really checked that, because those are usually the moments you want your data or your model to fit well.
So Martin Andreasen, Juan, and me have now a paper where we actually show that you don't need to use simulated method of moments to do that, because there is actually closed form solutions for the first and second moments of the model solve up to third order perturbation. And then you can check that because you don't need to resolve. The problem of SMM in this type of situations is that it's relatively sensitive to small details of the simulation. So having an analytic formula, I think, is very important.
No, that definitely helps. What you see, if you estimate it, you get quite strong price rigidities that are estimated. In general, the model features quite a huge amount of persistence. You have the same with consumption habits. And what you see is that the capital adjustment costs are relatively high, while the utilization costs are relatively low. And that's exactly this trade-off that you're getting. And what we also see is that our Taylor rule is estimated to quite strongly react to changes in output. So our central bank is quite responsive, and we also get a low interest rate smoothing.
Excuse me. Can you comment on the free elasticity? Is it 0.06, the free elasticity?
That's very close to linear. So it's 1 plus this.
Okay, so it's 1 over that.
Oh, so it's very high.
Yeah, it's
It's
16.
very high, you mean?
Yeah.
This is very high.
It's not the indivisible labor model.
It's close to the indivisible labor model.
And the capital adjustment costs are very high.
Yes.
What is it?
That goes to your point at the beginning, that you really want capital to be Lucas. You want capital to be fixed in the short run, so labor really takes everything and you get a big kick in the short run.
Right. And also the free elasticity.
And the free elasticity really tells you, you're going to have a little bit of a check. The free elasticity plus GHH means you are only going to respond to this change in the marginal, in the shadow price of leisure, and you're going to respond a lot to that.
If you then simulate the model, you see that the moments are generally very, very close. So the model fits the data quite well, given those estimations. If you now look at the model impulse responses, so this is the standard simultaneous 2 standard deviation shock, we get that output, consumption, and investment drop on impact. So that's, again, the mechanism that your markups go up. That's also a reason why inflation goes up. So the half-life of most of those volatility shocks is estimated to be quite low, except for monetary policy. And despite getting the co-movement we would usually expect, we see that the effect on output is relatively low with only 0.025%. And the reason for this is that our model implies strong general equilibrium effects that dampen the shock propagation. So most importantly, it's the central bank that responds.
Yeah, it's just so the reason it's a relatively small effect is you get this impact effect where hours goes right now. Hours goes down.
Where's ours then? What's
So ours is not plotted here, but ours also goes down, although a bit. And the major reason here is that our model is fitted so we have 6 processes, including technology, and our model is fitted in a way that given both the level and the volatility shock processes, it fits the data. And in a sense, this drives down the overall effects because your shock propagation has to be estimated in a way that it's not too big because the model still has to fit the data.
Okay, so just trying to understand relative to the previous paper, which seemed to find like a different result. So is this because of there are differences in the model, but is it because of a different parameterization fundamentally, or what is the?
So one thing is in their model, they only have 4 shocks, so they don't have the technology part. So the model has to give room for the technology part in the sense of the transmission mechanism. That dampens the effects. Then their peak response is about 4 times our size, I think. You get point.
But I don't understand that argument. Because what does it matter if we have a volatility shock or a shock to technology or not? Think about it in this way. You are getting a third order approximation to the decision rule of the agents. Okay? The only way in which other shocks are going to matter are in the cross product terms of the second order and the third order of the shock to technology multiplied by the shock to volatility of the fiscal policy. The coefficients on those terms are usually very, very small. So whether
No, it's not the cross interaction, but the idea here is that, let's say your model, you simulate it with your 4 types of shocks, and it gives you an output volatility of, let's say, 1%. And I'm now saying I add technology shocks to it, which also give you an additional volatility because they're not perfectly counteracting the other shocks. So our model would then suddenly imply that the volatility of output would not be your 1%, but 1.5%.
Yeah, but that should matter for the business cycle, for the unconditional moments of the model. It should not matter for the Boltzmann functions.
But given that the model is estimated, and we have those 6 shocks, and you say that the data implies only 1%, not 1.5, it means that all the amplification, given your shocks in your model, has to be estimated to be lower.
You estimate the stochastic volatility process simultaneously with the rest of the model.
You get different parameters, because the model has to fit the data given all those exogenous shock processes.
Is it different parameters in the sort of in the stochastic volatility model, or different parameters?
No, in the amplification process. So those parameters that are estimated with the simulated method of moments imply a different amplification of the underlying shock processes. I don't think that the underlying estimates from particle filter are that different, but it's rather that
it's the structural parameters of the model that are different, and that in some sense your general equilibrium feedback is much stronger. Is that?
Yes.
Is that the way to?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And what is the key? What is the key parameter that makes? Is it the friction elasticity or?
Here it's pretty high.
Oh, yeah, 2. Well, I guess. I don't know.
actually it's so the simulated method of moments actually gives you lower feedback from almost every parameter in the model. So it's generally dampened. And to see that, the model itself is capable of generating quite large effects. What we did here is, so you get a drop of an output of 1.5%. And the way that happens is we decrease, for one thing, the habit persistence, the real and the nominal rigidity. So everything that decreases the amplification of the shocks. And most importantly, for monetary policy, we decrease the feedback coefficients. So on the one hand, our central bank now reacts less to contemporaneous economic conditions, and most importantly, to output growth. And if you do that, then inflation goes up by quite a bit, and output drops by considerably more, because the central bank currently does not respond to this huge drop in output as strong as it did before. And so in a sense, although we cannot strictly test this, if you're stuck at the zero lower bound, so that's the other paper around, then those effects might be considerably larger. But this parameterization, and that's the underlying issue here, comes with some costs because it implies unrealistically large business cycles. If you simulate the model given this parameterization, you get that output is 4 times as volatile as it should be.
Yeah, and as you have TFP volatility as well, when you look at the actual data, does that turn out to line up quite highly with policy volatility? Is it the sense to which the economy is volatile, and as you're putting more of it into policy and you're allowing some of it to go through TFP? Which I'm not saying is right or wrong, but just as an understanding where the volatility is coming from. If you have more of it as TFP and less as policy, then a kind of one unit move in policy is likely to be less important. If you look at your stochastic vol on TFP, is it positively correlated with policy?
Yes, and it's actually also positively correlated with the Baker-Bloom-Davis measure.
Sure, no, I'm not surprised about that. I mean,
Yeah, so it is about the same. So TFP uncertainty has about the same correlation with policy uncertainty as the other types. So in general, volatility seems to be hugely correlated.
Sure, that's our, as Scott suggests, that's kind of our issue with endogeneity. It's hard to tell what's causing what. So, okay.
Couldn't you estimate some joint process for TFP, tax rates?
We haven't done that yet. That's one on the next things on our agenda. So this IID assumption might not be innocuous, given that we observe that they might be correlated. Okay, one more thing I want to point out is that in this general equilibrium type of model, you actually get the effect that capital tax uncertainty here kind of acts expansionary. And the reason is this combination out of high capital adjustment costs, while the capital utilization costs are quite low. So if uncertainty here grows up, it means that people start investing but just simply use it not that much, and that drives output up. While other things like labor tax uncertainty actually behave the way we think they would do, so they lead to a contraction in output. Okay, so summarizing, we found strong evidence for time-varying volatility of policy variables. And despite allowing for several option-like features, we have that aggregate effects of policy risk only have minor effects on the business cycle. So in some sense, our model is capable of generating uncertainty effects that are strong, but it implies then unrealistically large fluctuations. The reason we found that this is the case is that our parameter estimates imply strong general equilibrium effects, which dampen then the aggregate effects that uncertainty has. And as I said, the effects at the zero lower bound may be considerably larger. And as I guess I have still a few minutes?
6 minutes.
Okay. Yes?
This paper in the previous one, some general questions. I guess what I would like to see as an evaluation is take the model, the overall model, and my best estimate of the realized shock sequences in the model, and how much of the actual data and say output fluctuations do I see. Then turn off the exogenous policy shocks. How much does it matter? And then further turn off the endogenous response of policy uncertainty to other shocks in the model and see how much it matters. So that would give me a better sense, because it may be, and maybe you can answer this off the cuff, that the model, all of the shocks in the model jointly do a poor job of explaining the realized output series. I just don't know.
So the reason we didn't do that in the paper, we thought about it. It's because, so at the end of the day, this is one of these standard models without financial frictions. That model has a very difficult time explaining what happens in the data in 2008, 2009. The only way it can do it is by having like these 8 standard deviation shocks to demand and productivity, etc. So something we could do, and that will be an interesting research project, will be to take a richer version with financial frictions like Bernanke, Gerler, Gilchrist, or Cristiano Moto Rostaño, because those models with a relatively sensible shock to financial frictions can explain 2008, 2009, extend these models with fiscal volatility, and then do that decomposition. The reason we didn't go there was, I mean, there is nothing more than, just a couple of months in front of the computer doing it, so there is nothing conceptually, was that in that model it would be a little bit hard to convey to the audience what was the specific things done by Cristiano Moto Rostaño versus the specific things doing through fiscal volatility. So we thought that just as a first step, trying to have a more standard model would make the point clearer. But if you were the editor and you tell me, do that and I get the paper through, I will do it.
but in terms of where we are professionally in thinking about the role of uncertainty shocks in general, and policy uncertainty shocks in particular, I think the exercises I described are the ones you really want to look at to know how much modeling effort should we put in this direction.
I know. And in fact, I have reasons to believe that in this type of Cristiano Moto Rostaño models, the effects of fiscal or policy in general uncertainty are going to be large. There is a student on the market this year from MIT called Ditela, student of Ivan Berni, and he takes a version of Grunemeyer-Sannikov model of financial friction, which is kind of a different type of model, but it shares many of the same ideas. And he shows that a volatility, he has an underlying process for productivity, and he doesn't get into anything over that. And he gets as a shock to volatility in that model actually gives you a lot of action in this model. So if you could reinterpret that as a shock to policy, then in the Grunemeyer-Sannikov model you will get a lot of action, which suggests to me that if we import that into a Cristiano Moto Rostaño, you will also get a lot of action. But this is just coffee conversation, so take it only with P equal to 0.6.
So I think one of the questions that actually pops up is if this time is really different. So, for example, we know that for policy uncertainty or for uncertainty to matter in those types of standard DSGE models, we need something that brings us more towards partial equilibrium. So, for example, the zero lower bound. Or we might have something like subjective uncertainty. But the challenge then there is that at the zero lower bound also other shocks are usually amplified. So we need that volatility shocks are actually more amplified than anything else. So that means that, for example, contractionary fiscal policy or things like oil prices, the euro crisis, everything that might act on the level shocks actually have to be dampened, and we need to make kind of room for the effects of uncertainty. And also in this type of model, we need this increase in markups. And then the next question is, how long does price adjustment take? And we know from Joe Waffer's paper that price flexibility increases in times of high uncertainty, which makes it even more tougher to explain the current situation with fiscal uncertainty. In that sense, you kind of have to ask if this time is really different. So for uncertainty to be the main culprit, it seems to be the case that we need that, because studies like Stock-Watson or even Fernald say that the current recession seems to be kind of pretty normal, but only a lot deeper. So in terms of Occam's razor, I might kind of question if uncertainty is the huge big effect that we need. So is this time different, or is it all the other shocks that people like, for example, Krugman's standard mantra, it's all about aggregate demand, are actually more important? And our paper kind of asked that given all those other things that are going on in the economy, we find that the uncertainty channel is not that big. So kind of what we need in terms of missing ingredients is that all those other things are not that important relative to what current policy uncertainty gives us. And
It's a fair enough point. Stock and Watson's maybe not the best site. So Stock and Watson, interesting claim, uncertainty is a big deal. But they claim that and financial. They say the
financial uncertainty.
And uncertainty is so highly correlated, they can't distinguish them. But they say if you hold the VAR coefficients up to 2007 constant, and feed in the 2008, 2012 shocks, if you just feed in the observed financial / uncertainty shock, it explains most of the drop. I guess they agree. They say yeah. They kind of say yes. This time it's not different. And I mean, I don't know how many of you've read it, but their Brookings piece they say, is it the case that 08 to 012 the economy is different, i.e. the VAR coefficients are different, or is it just the shocks are very big? And their conclusion is it's just the shocks are very big. And what are the shocks that are big? And they say it's finance / uncertainty, and they're so collinear that the correlation between those two are like 0.85. You can't tell which is which.
And then the question is, given that we are in what usually people tell is a financial crisis, if it's financial or it's really the uncertainty, and then the next step would be, is it political uncertainty?
I agree. So I mean, I don't think any of us can tell, but as an exercise, I think their conclusion is it's not different. But then their conclusion is what it is some combination of those.
Because he just referred to, it seems to be different, you need 8 standard deviation shocks, yeah, but might be that they happened. So that time is not really
Shocks
different.
are different, but it's the coefficients are. I guess they break it down into other, it's just bigger shocks.
Yeah.
Different in the sense
They say
that
it's bigger shocks.
standard deviations above what you normally expect.
And he was referring to we need probably different transmission mechanism or different general mechanism. And that's, I think, one of the unsettled points that we still have to figure out.